Inaudible for the interpreter.
Distingué. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres nominations?
Are there any further motions? No, but I think we will have an excellent vice chair. So, Mr. Godin, you have been nominated. Do you accept this nomination? Yes, Mr. Chair. With pleasure. I'll be on your team. Should we vote, or is there unanimous consent? Unanimous consent. Bravo, Mr. VP.
Qui, c'est... Moi, Madame la première fois. Allez-y.
Now for the election of the second vice chair. Pursuant to House Order 1062 or Standing Order 1062, the second vice chair must be part of an opposition party other than the official opposition. Mr. Dalton, I would like to nominate Mr. Mario Beaulieu. Are there any further motions? No. In that case, are there any objections? If not, I will call the question. Madam Clerk, I propose that there is unanimous consent. Unanimous consent for Mr. Beaulieu to be elected. I declare Mr. Beaulieu duly elected second vice chair of the committee.
Félicitations.
Congratulations, everyone, and welcome to this wonderful committee. I can tell you that this is the best committee. That's what I find anyway. This is where the characteristics that unite our country trump all else. Madam Clerk, are the bells going to ring? It's possible. Just let me check.
Peut-être juste une observation.
Mr. Beaulieu, we don't have any representation from the NDP, just an observation.
Pardon, on voit tout de suite les cloches sonnent. On a 30...
The bells are ringing now. We have 30 minutes. Do we have unanimous consent right now to stay here another 20 minutes of those 30? Great.
Ça va tout le monde?
Does that suit everyone? Great, so we have unanimous consent.
Alors, voilà.
So now we will move on to housekeeping. So welcome to meeting number 1 of the Standing Committee on Official Languages. Today, our meeting will be a hybrid meeting. We have some members participating here in the room in person and others participating virtually using the Zoom platform. When it comes to speaking order, the clerk and myself will do our best to ensure the accurate speaking order for everyone participating virtually or in person. As a reminder, taking photos of one's screen or screen captures are not permitted. Because of the pandemic and in line with the public health measures, All members participating in person must follow the following measures to ensure everyone's health is protected. Everyone showing symptoms must participate online. In the room, everyone must maintain 2 meters distance, whether standing or seated. A non-medical mask must be worn at all times when members are walking around the room. It is strongly recommended for the mask also to be worn even when seated. Everyone participating in person must maintain proper hand hygiene using the hand sanitizer at the entrance to the room. The committee rooms are cleaned before and after committee meetings. Everyone is encouraged to use the provided wipes to clean their area. As chair, I will work to enforce all of these measures, and I thank everyone in advance for their cooperation.
Voilà, Madame la greffière.
Thank you. Madam Clerk.
OK, nous allons procéder par les motions de...
We will now continue with the routine motions. Yes, Francis. I have a copy of the motions here in front of us. I can distribute them. I've made enough for everyone in the room if they would like, but I think that everyone is probably fairly familiar with them already. I'm not sure. I'm looking at the time, and I just want to make sure that the interpreters can hear me even though I'm speaking with my mask. Yes, indeed, we can. Yes, thank you. I could read them, and what I would suggest is that we move a motion to adopt all of them all at once, if that's all right. Okay, so I will read them. Analyst services that the committee retain as needed and at the discretion of the chair, the services of one or more analysts from the Library of Parliament to assist it in its work. Subcommittee on Agenda and Procedure, that the Subcommittee on Agenda and Procedure be established and be composed of 5 members. That's if we decide to have a subcommittee. The chair, 1 member from each recognized party, and that the subcommittee work in a spirit of collaboration. Meeting without a quorum, that the chair be authorized to hold meetings to receive evidence and to have that evidence published when a quorum is not present, provided that at least 4 members are present, including 2 members of the opposition parties and 2 members of the government party. But when traveling outside the parliamentary precinct, that the meeting begin after 15 minutes regardless of members present. Time for opening remarks and questioning of witnesses. That witnesses be given 5 minutes for their opening statements, and that whenever possible, witnesses provide their opening statements 72 hours in advance, and that during the questioning of witnesses at the discretion of the chair, be 6 minutes allocated to the first questioner of each party, as follows for the first round. Conservative Party, Liberal Party, Bloc Québécois, New Democratic Party. For the second and subsequent rounds, the order and time for questioning be as follows. Conservative Party, 5 minutes. Liberal Party, 5 minutes. Bloc Québécois, 2.5 minutes. NDP, 2.5 minutes. Conservative Party, 5 minutes. Liberal Party, 5 minutes. Everyone still with me? Document distribution, that only the clerk of the committee be authorized to distribute documents to members of the committee, provided the documents are in both official languages, and that the witnesses be advised accordingly. And that all witnesses, be advised in advance. Working meals, that the clerk of the committee at the discretion of the chair be authorized to make the necessary arrangements to provide working meals for the committee and its subcommittees. Travel, accommodation, and living expenses of witnesses, that if requested, reasonable travel, accommodation, and living expenses be reimbursed to witnesses not exceeding 2 representatives per organization, and that in exceptional circumstances, payment for more representatives be made at the discretion of the chair. Access to in-camera meetings, that unless otherwise ordered, Each committee member be allowed to be accompanied by one staff member at an in-camera meeting, and that one additional person from each House officer's office be allowed to be present. Transcripts of in-camera meetings, that one copy of the transcript of each in-camera meeting be kept in the committee clerk's office for consultation by members of the committee or by their staff, and that the analysts assigned to the committee also have access to the in-camera transcripts. Notice of motion. That a 48-hour notice interpreted as 2 nights be required for any substantive motion to be moved in committee, unless the substantive motion relates directly to business then under consideration, provided that A, the notice be filed with the clerk of the committee no later than 4 p.m. from Monday to Friday. B, the motion be distributed to members and the offices of the whips of each recognized party in both official languages by the clerk on the same day the said notice was transmitted, if it was received no later than the deadline hour. C, notices received after the deadline hour or on non-business days be deemed to have been received during the next business day, and that when the committee is holding meetings outside the parliamentary precinct, no substantive motion may be moved. Orders of reference from the House respecting bills, that in relation to orders of reference from the House respecting bills, A, the clerk of the committee shall, upon the committee receiving such an order of reference, write to each member who is not a member of a caucus represented on the committee to invite those members to file with the clerk of the committee in both official languages any amendments to the bill which is the subject of the said order, which they would suggest that the committee consider. B, suggested amendments filed pursuant to paragraph A at least 48 hours prior to the start of clause-by-clause consideration of the bill to which the amendments relate shall be deemed to be proposed during the said consideration, provided that the committee may, by motion, vary this deadline in respect of a given bill. And C, during the clause-by-clause consideration of a bill, the chair shall allow a member who filed suggested amendments, pursuant to paragraph A, an opportunity to make brief representations in support of them. Technical tests for witnesses, that the clerk inform each witness who is to appear before the committee that the House Administration Support Team must conduct technical tests to check the connectivity and the equipment used to ensure the best possible sound quality, and that the chair advise the committee at the start of each meeting of any witness who did not perform the required technical tests. Linguistic review, that all documents submitted for committee business that do not come from a federal department, members' offices, or that have not been translated by the Translation Bureau be sent for prior linguistic review by the Translation Bureau before being distributed to members. Mr. Chair, good news, I'm done. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Drouet. 3 little points. We encourage everyone to wear the mask even when they're seated. The interpreters can hear us well. Second, Ms. Ashton, can you hear us? We didn't see you earlier. Yes, I'm here and I can hear you. All right, wonderful. Before we move to the vote or to the passage, I see Marc Serret, who has their hand raised. No, Madame, no. Yes? 1 second. Mr. Drouet, when you read the text of the subcommittee, it's 5 members, which is written, and I think the word was not said, but it would be the subcommittee as per usual, unless Mr. Drouet had a different plan. No, I didn't have any other intentions. My intentions are noble. Mr. Godin, you had a comment? Yes. Just a similar remark, Mr. Chair. It's that in the section technical tests for witnesses, Mr. Drouin said that the it should say afin in French. He said before, and yes, it does indeed say afin and not avant. So that instead of before. Is that all right for everyone? 5, not 5 witnesses, 5 members for the subcommittee. That has been specified. Is there unanimous consent? Yes. I'm looking at the screen. Everyone is all right. Very good. Okay. So, passed unanimously. How many more minutes till the vote, Madam Clerk? I see that we have 17 minutes left. However, I think there's a little bit of a delay with Parleview, so I would say that you have about 15 minutes left. Yes, Mario. I don't know if it's a good moment. I wanted to propose two motions. Another member had their hand up before, but in terms of the vote, are we comfortable to continue for a couple of minutes? 7 minutes. We need unanimous consent. We weren't specific. How many more minutes should we give ourselves? What do you think? 7 minutes?
Parfait.
Very good. I would prefer that we be careful because it's a bit of a delay. I suggest that we suspend right now to go and vote and that we come back afterwards if you're in agreement. And that I take note of the questions in chronological order. There's Madame Latanzio. There was Mario second. So we can come back after the vote. Would that work? Does that work? Ms. Ashton? Yes, thank you. So, Madame Latanzio, Mr. Beaulieu, Mr. Godin, third, and then Ms. Ashton. Very good. Okay, so we are going to suspend until after the vote.
Donc, en ordre
So in chronological order of raised hands, I open the floor to Ms. Latanzio. Good day. First of all, congratulations, Mr. Chair, on your election. I also want to congratulate the vice chairs on their election. And I'm pleased to see some of our colleagues from last session back again, and obviously our new members. Mr. Chair, I would like to table 4 motions regarding studies that I wish to propose for the committee. So with your permission, I will read the wording only of the titles to give you an idea of the nature of the motions. And then, according to custom, I will send them on to the clerk. So if I may, Mr. Chair, the first is regarding Air Canada. That the committee examine Air Canada's duty to provide service in both official languages. Ms. Latanzio, would you be able to send it at the same time? Send that now to Madam Clerk? Yes, I will. Do you want me to read it out beforehand? Yes. Please go ahead with the first one on Air Canada. So, pursuant to Standing Order 1083, Air Canada come to the committee and testify on its duties regarding official languages. The interpreter does not have a copy of this motion. And study the measures that Air Canada could take to fulfill its full obligations under the Official Languages Act, and invite Air Canada to discuss the measures that Air Canada takes for customer service and to ensure a bilingual working environment, and to invite the Commissioner of Official Languages to study historic obligations at Air Canada, linguistic obligations, that the committee hold at least 2 meetings and send a report with recommendations to the House, and that the committee request a government response to its report. The second motion would be entitled Francophone Immigration. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083F, the committee undertake a study to ensure that the government fulfills its duty to facilitate Francophone immigration outside of Quebec. the interpreter does not have a copy of this motion, that the committee study why the 4.4% immigration target was set in 2003. Ms. Latanzio, pardon me, I feel very rude to interrupt you. I'm just beginning as a chair, but I'm told that only one motion must be tabled at a time, and then it must be debated. Okay, I wish to submit the first motion. Would you like to propose them? Ms. Latanzio. Mr. Chair, I would have liked to propose all four, but if you would like for me to proceed one by one, I will abide by the rules.
Monsieur le Président, on s'entend que c'est des...
Mr. Chair, did you understand that these are just notices of motion?
Parfait, Madame Latanzio.
Perfect, Ms. Latanzio. There was some confusion because of the word propose, so excuse me for interrupting you. Please go ahead. You were talking about the motion on Francophone immigration. Thank you. I'll continue. So, Francophone immigration. A, that the committee examine why the 4.4% immigration target total was set in 2003 in the strategy to foster Francophone immigration toward Francophone communities outside of Quebec, why that target was not met. To invite the Commissioner of Official Languages. C, explore how the government can work to increase the demographic weight of Francophones in a minority setting. And D, provide recommendations to offset the shortage of French teachers in Canada, and examine how the government can increase opportunities for newcomers to Canada to learn French, and that the committee spend a minimum of 6 meetings on this study, that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House, and pursuant to Standing Order 109, the government table a response. The third motion is on the decline of French. That, pursuant to Standing Order 1083F, the committee undertake a study on the measures that the Government of Canada can take, as outlined in the speech from the throne, to assume its responsibility to promote and protect French, not only outside of Quebec, but also in Quebec, and that as part of this study, the Committee A, create an objective and detailed portrait of the situation of English and Francophone and Acadian communities using linguistic indicators, especially French as a mother tongue or mother tongue language spoken at home, main working language, etc.
B, study the government's policies and federal laws when it comes to protecting the French language and their efficacy and their impact on legislative measures for promoting and protecting the French language. C, that it examine all tools available to the government, including changes to be made to the Official Languages Act to promote the protection of both official languages in Canada, and that for that study, the committee would have a minimum of 7 meetings, and that those meetings would end by March 1st, 2022, and that the committee report its conclusions and recommendations to the House, and that pursuant to 109, the government provide an overall response. Mr. Chair, Chair, a point of order. should we not have these motions in both official languages in front of us so that we can see them? Is there some way that we could manage this situation? Mr. Dalton, I'm going to have to take a break. Unfortunately, there's a technical problem with my microphone. We are going to suspend for a moment and we'll come back with your point of order, but we need to deal with a technical problem in the room. Mr. Chair, I would just like to simply say that the motions have been sent to the clerk in both official languages. I know that my colleague would like to have the translation of these motions, but please be assured that the motions have been submitted in both official languages. Thank you. We're going to suspend for a couple of minutes.
All right. OK, nous reprenons.
All right, we'll get started again. All right, so I will repeat for those looking at home, we're on Mr. Dalton's point of order, and it's regarding the presentation of the motions in both official languages. And the clerk has just informed us that she's received the documents from Ms. Latanzio, and they should have been distributed to your P9s.
That's listening. Madame Latanzio, vous étiez...
Ms. Latanzio, I'm sorry we had some technical issues. You were presenting your notices of motion, and you can please continue. No problem, Mr. Chair. So I will continue with my notice of motion, my fourth notice of motion, which is called Linguistic Security. That pursuant to Standing Order 108.3F, the committee undertake a study on linguistic security that, as a part of this study, the committee A, considered the impact of declining linguistic security on official language minority groups, particularly among youth. B, study how the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated issues of linguistic security for Canadians. C, invite the Commissioner of Official Languages to share his findings on linguistic security in the federal public service. D, examine methods to alleviate linguistic security, and that the committee allocate a minimum of 5 meetings to this study. That the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House, and that, pursuant to Standing Order 109, the government table a comprehensive response. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Latanzio, for your notice of motion, which are now received in writing in our P9 email inboxes. Mr. Beaulieu. Yes, thank you. I would like to table a notice of 2 motions. The first is similar to one of Ms. Latanzio's motions. I will read it, and people will receive them in both official languages very quickly. Madam Clerk already has them. That pursuant to Standing Order 108.2, the committee undertake a study on the measures that the Government of Canada can take, as stated in the speech from the throne, to fulfill its responsibility to protect and promote French not only outside Quebec but also within Quebec, and that the testimony and documents obtained by the committee during the second session of the 43rd Parliament regarding the study be considered by the committee during the current session, and that the committee resume the witness schedule set out in the original work plan, and that as part of this study, the committee draw an objective and detailed picture of the situation of the English and French languages in Quebec, as well as the Francophone and Acadian communities, based on the main linguistic indicators, including French as a mother tongue, main language spoken at home, language substitutions, main language of work, etc. B, evaluate the effectiveness of the government's language policies and the current role of provincial and federal legislation in protecting and promoting the French language, as well as the impact of these policies on provincial legislative measures to protect and promote the French language, in particular the Charter of the French Language in Quebec. C, evaluate possible amendments to the Official Languages Act to align the government's will to protect the French language with provincial legislation. That in order to conduct this study, the committee allocate a minimum of 3 meetings, and that these be completed no later than June 1st, 2022, that the committee report on its findings and recommendations to the House, and that pursuant to Section 109 of the Standing Order, the government table a comprehensive response. So we had already started this study in the last session. There were 2.5 meetings left for that study, so that we restart that study with the same calendar of witnesses to respect the balance and point of view. The second motion goes back to a study that had also been started following Mr. Boulris's motion, that pursuant to Section 108.2 of the Standing Orders, the committee undertake a study on the measures that the Government of Canada can take to administer federal funds and the positive measures taken by federal institutions regarding post-secondary education for official language minority communities, OLMCs. That as part of this study, the committee compare federal funding for English and French post-secondary minority institutions, as well as federal funding for French post-secondary teaching institutions in Quebec. That the committee allocate a minimum of 2 meetings for this purpose. That the testimony and documents obtained by the committee during the second session of the 43rd Parliament concerning the study be considered by the committee during the current session. That the committee report on its observations and conclusions to the House. And that pursuant to Section 109 of the Standing Order, the government table a comprehensive response. Thank you very much, Mr. Beaulieu. Mr. Godin. Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have 3 different subjects, so I would like to move a motion and not present that the committee invite, and I suggest that it be for our next meeting, a 2-hour meeting, with the President and Chief Executive Officer of Air Canada to answer questions from parliamentarians on the place and importance of official languages at Air Canada. The documents have been tabled with the clerk. I also have 2 notices of motion. Official Languages Committee, the committee invite the Commissioner of Official Languages for a 2-hour meeting to brief the committee on pressing issues related to the application of the Official Languages Act in Canada. And third, notice of motion, that the committee invite the Minister of Official Languages to discuss her mandate, priorities, and urgent issues related to her portfolio. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Godin. Ms. Ashton. Oh, sorry. Wait a second, Ms. Ashton.
Oui. Alors, si je comprends bien, Madame la greffière est en...
Madam Clerk, if I understand, is sending the notices of motion around.
Maintenant, Monsieur Godin.
Now, Mr. Godin has tabled a motion, so it's no longer a notice of motion, which means we must debate it. I saw Ms. Latanzio's hand raised and then Mr. Drouin's hand. Ms. Latanzio, is it regarding this point? Yes, Mr. Chair. So I wanted to know something. I understand the point in Mr. Godin's motion, but given that in my notice of motion, I made mention of the official languages regarding Air Canada, I was wondering if when the subcommittee meets, it could manage these motions and invite the person who my colleague mentioned. I would have no objection to us beginning our committee studies with this new study on Air Canada. We'll be able to ask questions and move forward with the study. So I was wondering if it could be most efficient for the subcommittee to deal with this and for us to go with the first motion, Mr. Chair. Okay, thank you. But it is a motion, so we must debate it. Mr. Godin? Mr. Godin. Yes, Mr. Chair. I thank my colleague, and I believe we can integrate both motions. I wanted to invite Air Canada's CEO. So yes, perhaps the subcommittee can discuss this. But what's important is to accept that we need to be specific about one witness in the Air Canada study, and one of them needs to be the CEO. Perfect. Thank you. Mr. Drouin, on that point. I don't want to be too technical, but in principle, the motions that Mr. Godin read were not in order because we would have had to debate them right away. I'm sorry, Mr. Godin, but that's the rule. A motion tabled must be debated immediately, but instead we heard other motions read that were technically also out of order.
Effectivement.
Yes, and what the clerk is telling me is that, yes, the two other motions from Mr. Godin were only notices of motion. It's as if he had sent them to us by email. That's what I'm told. So there is a matter on the table. Yes, Mr. Godin, please go ahead. Well, Mr. Chair, if I made a procedural mistake, I would still ask for unanimous consent to accept that error. I'm not convinced that it was one. You can continue, or you can confirm, rather. Ms. Ashton, on that point? Yes, it is pertaining to that point. We had submitted ours to the clerk before the meeting. We also have a motion concerning Air Canada, recognizing that the events this fall were very concerning, but also acknowledging the fact that this situation has continued for a number of years. I'm ready to support Mr. Godin's motion and to support a brief study, as Ms. Latanzio has proposed, but I would also wish to make an amendment, and that would be for us to invite the ministers of transport and of official languages, as well as the Commissioner of Official Languages, the Commissioner Théberge, as well as Commissioner Fraser, who presented the study a few years ago on that Air Canada situation. So we are ready to support the witnesses, but we were also hoping for it to be a brief study, 3 or perhaps 4 meetings in length, to explore that topic. I believe that can be done with the cooperation of ministers.
Oui, Madame Ashton, merci. Il y avait beaucoup de contenu dans...
Thank you, Ms. Ashton. There was a lot of content in your intervention. You would like to make an amendment, but you would like to do a study on Air Canada. Is that right? I think every party wants to do that study. So to clarify, on the debatable motion by Mr. Godin, and correct me, Mr. Godin, you wanted to have the CEO of Air Canada here for 2 hours to testify. Is that right? Okay. So did you want to amend that point, strictly speaking? Or did you just want to highlight that the NDP would like to make amendments on that study, a more detailed study? Well, not too detailed a study, but I also wanted to add the witnesses of the responsible ministers, as well as Commissioner Théberge and the former Commissioner of Official Languages, who looked into this matter more closely a few years ago. Mr. Beaulieu. Okay, so now we have a proposed amendment. Mr. Beaulieu, is your comment pertaining to that? Well, I agreed with the first motion, but I'm not against the amendment either. We'll see what everyone thinks.
Un instant, les amis.
Just one moment. I want to make sure we're on track. So we have a main motion, a proposed amendment, and I'm told that with a proposed motion, we can't stretch too far from what was proposed in the initial motion. That's what I am understanding. So on Ms. Ashton's amendment, Mr. Bodio, I'm not sure I understood what your intervention was. You're not against it? So what you're telling us is that you would prefer for us to stick with Mr. Godin's original motion? Well, I agree with the initial motion. If Mr. Godin wants to make it part of a broader study, I'll give the floor to Mr. Drouin first. And we're still talking about Ms. Ashton's proposed amendment. So it's not receivable?
Parfait. Vous avez compris que
Great. So the clerk is giving me a hand here. So committee members, order. So Ms. Ashton, I've been told that as it is, the amendment is not in order unless there is unanimous consent. And if there is, then we can move forward with that amendment. So obviously it is an amendment to Mr. Godin's original motion regarding a 2-hour slot as soon as possible with the CEO of Air Canada. Mr. Godin, could Ms. Ashton reread her amendment? Yes, please go ahead, Ms. Ashton, to know what we're voting on.
En fait, je suis pas certaine.
Ms. Ashton. In fact, reading it now, I'm not sure if it's possible, procedurally speaking. But what we want is to add witnesses. So the official languages minister and the transport minister, as well as the Commissioner Thiberge and former Commissioner Fraser, who looked into Air Canada during his 2016 study. That's what we wish to do in order to explore what happened this fall and the challenges we're facing when it comes to service in French at Air Canada, and to be able to find a mechanism that can address this situation, the current situation. Mr. Arsenault. Ms. Ashton, as the chair, I'll propose something. So I think you're proposing that we carried a study, as Ms. Latanzio had said. Perhaps we could stick to the original motion because, of course, everyone heard in the media what came out about the CEO of Air Canada. We can meet with him for 2 hours, and that could perhaps lead us to wanting to conduct a more fulsome study. Would that garner unanimous consent? Francis, would you like to take the floor? I just wanted to say that I am ready to support Mr. Godin's motion as is. And any other discussion about other studies, as I think we've agreed, we can send to the subcommittee to deal with. And we're coming back in January as well. Let's keep that in mind. Mr. Serrier, was your hand raised?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add to what my colleague Francis was saying. I support Mr. Godin's motion, and after that, we can send all other motions to the subcommittee to decide on studies after that. Is there unanimous consent for us to proceed with Mr. Godin's motion?
tout le monde s'accorde.
Everyone seems to agree, so the motion is carried.
Godin, j'avais Madame Ashton.
After Mr. Godin, I had Ms. Ashton. Ms. Ashton, your hand was fourth in line. Yes, I still wish to table the motion I was referring to, because I think that the Air Canada matter is essential. it's so serious that attention must be paid to it. So our first motion is regarding that. So, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, following the events from fall 2021 and the concerns shared by Canadians regarding the respect of official languages by Air Canada, the committee undertake a study on the measures adopted by the government and by Air Canada following the presentation of the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages presented on June 7, 2016, on the road to increased compliance through an effective enforcement regime. That the committee invite the Minister of Transport, Minister of Official Languages, and the Commissioner of Official Languages to lay out the steps needed to follow in order for Air Canada to respect its obligations to serve Canadians in both official languages. That the committee invite the President and CEO of Air Canada to testify on the importance of respecting the official languages and the measures taken by senior management so that Air Canada's culture reflects Canada's linguistic duality, that the committee hold no fewer than 4 meetings on this study, and that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House, and pursuant to Standing Order 109, the government table a comprehensive response. And the second motion, of which we also sent a copy to the clerk. Excuse me, Ms. Ashton, is it a notice of motion or a motion? We submitted it as a notice of motion, so it's a notice of motion. So this is a notice of motion as well? Yes. Thank you. Yes, that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake a study on Francophone immigration in language minority communities surrounding the presentation of the Commissioner of Official Languages, which is entitled Statistical Analysis of the 4.4% Immigration Target for French-Speaking Immigrants in Francophone Minority Communities. Almost 20 years after setting the target, it is time to do more and do better. That the committee welcomed the Commissioner of Official Languages' testimony on the study, that the committee welcomed the Department of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada's testimony on the study, that the committee hear from representatives of Francophone and Acadian communities on their experience with Francophone immigration in their communities, and that the committee hold no fewer than 5 meetings on this study, and that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House, and that, pursuant to Standing Order 109, the government table a comprehensive response.
Merci, Madame Ashton.
Thank you, Ms. Ashton. And I believe the notices of motion are already being sent around thanks to the effectiveness and efficiency of our dearly beloved clerk.
C'est parti.
It has been sent. I'm told they have been sent. So we already have lots of work set out before us at this first meeting. Mr. Godin, I would ask for unanimous consent for us to gather all motions and notices of motion that were tabled today, for us to transfer those to the subcommittee so that the subcommittee can come up with a plan which can hopefully be tabled to us at our first meeting. That can accelerate our process and help us effectively schedule our calendar for schedules and take into account the represented parties. Ms. Latanzio, is it pertaining to this point? Yes, I think my colleague was reading my thoughts. I simply wanted to say that I was listening to my colleague's comments, and it seems that there are many points in common between the motions tabled. And I think the subcommittee would be best suited to disentangle the various proposals, especially concerning the Air Canada suggestion. So the only motion that we have not presented is the one, or the only one that does not overlap, is the linguistic security suggestion. But, Mr. Chair, I was going to suggest exactly the same thing, that all of this be forwarded to the subcommittee. Mr. Beaulieu. I think it's very important. There were 2 studies that weren't completed last study, so it's very important for us to keep in mind the doability of these studies. Is there unanimous consent?
Et vous alliez dire quelque chose?
Mr. Saleh, I would just like to say, Chair, that at the subcommittee, there's yourself, there's a Vice Chair Godin, but also Nikki Ashton and myself who are on that subcommittee. So I just wanted to clarify that. All right. Very good. It's a good group. It's going to be a great subcommittee. So is there unanimous consent, as requested by Mr. Godin, to have the subcommittee meet to clean up all of these proposals and notices of motion? I see no opposition, so unanimous consent carried. Is there anything else, Madam Clerk? Well, I think we're off to a good start because there's no further debate. So is there anything else that you would like to bring to the table, honorable colleagues? Yes, Mr. Chair, 2 things. First is I'd like to congratulate you as chair of this committee, and I would like to take this opportunity at the end of this first meeting to wish all of you committee members very happy holidays. Take some time with your families and make sure you get some good time, because in 2022 we've got a lot of work to do and we don't know what the world's going to look like in 2022. So thank you. So thank you very much. That having been said, happy holidays to all. Take the time for yourselves and for your families, and this meeting is adjourned.
Merci.